Welcome back. Today we're going to continue our study of monopolies by looking at how government may choose to regulate the monopolies that do exist. We'll have a goal of being able to explain the effects that monopolies have on the market as far as price, quantity, and deadweight loss, and we'll describe ways that the government can address these challenges by regulating monopolies. We begin by reminding ourselves how to compare monopoly to competition. We remember that the way to find the monopolist quantity is to look for where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That point then directs us to the quantity. So we find MC equals MR, we go down to find the Q. We draw a vertical line from that Q up. We see where it hits the demand curve. We see where it hits ATC. Where it hits the demand curve is price. Where it hits ATC is our total cost. And so we can see the price is greater than ATC, so there is a profit. Perfectly competitive industry operates where marginal cost equals supply intersects with demand. So we find that point right here. That's our perfectly competitive quantity. That's our perfectly competitive price. And so we can make some generalizations. One, that monopolies produce fewer goods. There is less production for the monopolist than perfect competition, because the Q is less for a monopoly than perfect competition. That monopoly charges a higher price than perfect competition. And that monopolies have a long-run economic profit. Another thing that does sometimes come up on the graph that College Board will ask is about the revenue maximizing point. The revenue maximizing point is the point at which total revenue has reached its maximum, where marginal revenue equals zero. So the revenue maximizing point is where the marginal revenue curve crosses the horizontal axis. It's not particularly important to our decision making, but it is something that does come up on the AP exam. Now, because monopolies produce less than perfect competition and because monopoly charges a higher price, it does create a problem, and that is that beneficial trades do not occur. Deadweight loss is created. We lose both consumer surplus and producer surplus. And that is sort of problematic from the eyes of the government, especially because it's harmful to consumers. This is why, in general, the government regulates against monopolies and prevents them from occurring or breaks them up once they've established themselves. That's why the government is constantly pursuing opportunities to create competition in the market. But that's not always the case. That is, sometimes the government allows monopolies to exist, but only monopolies that generally fit a common definition. And that definition is that they are natural monopolies. Natural monopolies are monopolies that government does allow to exist because they have extraordinarily high fixed costs. And because of those extraordinarily high fixed costs, there is economies of scale that go beyond the relevant demand for the industry. That is, that as we produce more goods, it becomes increasingly less expensive. Our average total cost curve is still going down beyond any amount that the market could possibly want and more. So that it's cheaper to have one firm producing the product than it would be to have multiple firms producing them. So some examples of natural monopolies would the natural gas company or the electric company, or back in the day, the cable company or the water company. It's so expensive to create sewer lines and water treatment plants that it would be wildly inefficient to have more than one company do it. You wouldn't want to set up your house with 4 or 5 different sewer cables and have 4 or 5 different sewer companies digging up your street in order to create all of the infrastructure that goes to treating water. It's just simpler and less expensive for one company to do that job. Same with electricity or natural gas. And so the government says, all right, it's cheaper for one company to do this because of the nature of the industry. So we will allow the monopoly to exist. But because monopolies charge higher prices and produce fewer goods and creates deadweight loss, the government will regulate those companies to minimize the negative impact on consumers. Graphically, a natural monopoly would look like this. Downward sloping demand curve, Average total costs are dropping, still diminishing, still getting cheaper. The bigger we make the company, the cheaper it is to produce, still cheaper. It doesn't hit its minimum ATC until well beyond the demand curve. And so it makes sense for one company to produce the goods, because to have more than one company would be to raise the price for individual consumers. So the government has some options. One would be public ownership. The government could take over the company. Unfortunately, the history of public ownership of companies has not always been particularly bright, at least in this country. And there's really no incentive for the government to lower its costs or operate efficiently. When they do a poor job, all they need to do is raise taxes in order to cover their expenses. So public ownership doesn't always work. It's not always the best option. Instead, government tends to turn more towards regulation and setting a price ceiling to prevent the monopolies from charging the monopolist price and taking advantage of the position they have in the market at the expense of consumers. The question then is, what price should they charge, or what price should they allow the monopolist to charge consumers? And so there are some options. One would be to do nothing, regulate nothing. We'd have the monopoly price. We'd find where MR and MC intersect. We'd go up to the demand curve. That would be the price the monopolist would naturally want to charge. It creates an economic profit. We've already identified that that's not ideal, and so the government's going to do something other than that. So maybe they say, well, we want to eliminate all deadweight loss. We would like to reach the socially optimal or the allocatively efficient outcome. We'd like to go where perfect competition would be. So they could charge the socially optimal price where marginal cost and demand intersect. That would eliminate all deadweight loss, and it would eliminate any sort of reduction in total surplus. But there's a problem here. The problem here is that if we charge this perfectly competitive price, this socially optimal price, then we have created a loss for the monopolist, because price at this quantity, price is less than average total cost. And if there's a loss for the monopolist, in the long run, the monopolist will just stop producing the good. So if you set the socially optimal price for, let's say, electricity, then the electric company will just, in the long run, turn off the power and everything goes dark. And that's not particularly beneficial to consumers either. And so there is a third option that sort of lies in between the two, and that is to charge what's known as a fair return price. The government could set a price ceiling at where the ATC curve intersects with demand. They could set a ceiling where the quantity produces zero economic profit. Again, that's fine for the monopolist, because economic profit just says they can't be doing better doing something else than they currently are, so they're not leaving. And they're still making accounting profit. They've got lots and lots of money at the end of the year, so they can drive fancy cars and have big houses and all that stuff. But this would be the sort of best possible world, because it doesn't allow the firm to charge monopoly price and have monopoly profit. And it prevents the firm from being forced to have a loss and shutting down. So this fair return price leaves economic profit at zero. Is it perfect? No. There's still deadweight loss here. There are beneficial trades that might have occurred. We have this area right here of deadweight loss. But that deadweight loss is as small as it can get without driving the firm into a loss and driving him out of the market. So fair return price is sort of the goal when it comes to regulating natural monopolies. We can give you a chance to try and practice this a little bit. So given the graph on the left, try and identify the price and quantity of the unregulated monopoly. Figure out what the price and quantity would be for the perfectly competitive industry. See if you can figure out the boundaries for the area of profit for an unregulated monopolist, and then see what the socially optimal price and quantity would be, and the fair return price and quantity would be. So in a moment, press pause, see what you come up with, and then press play again and see how well you did to test your skills. If you went ahead and paused and worked through this, then you would have found the following answers. The unregulated monopoly would be at a price of P6 and a quantity of Q1, because we would find MC equals MR. Goes down, that's Q1. We go all the way up to the demand curve, in which case price would be P6. There is a profit for the unregulated monopolist, we look at the difference between price and ATC at the profit maximizing quantity. So we go to Q1, draw that vertical line, we hit ATC, we hit the demand curve, we see that price is greater than ATC, and so our profit is the area bounded from the points P6, A, B, and P5. Perfect competition would be operating at a place where marginal cost and demand intersect, because that's where supply and demand intersect. That'd be point F. So that tells us that the perfectly competitive industry would have a price of quantity of Q3 and a price of P1. Socially optimal would be where the perfectly competitive industry would be. And so again, socially optimal would be at a price of P1 and Q3, but that does create a loss for us because at a quantity of Q3, price is less than ATC. Fair return would be where average total cost crosses the demand curve at point C. There'd be a quantity of Q2 and a price of P4. There would be no profit or loss. Profit would be normal in this case. One final thing, and that is sometimes you will see a special case for monopolies drawn on an AP exam in which marginal costs are assumed to be constant or flat. If that's the case, it might look like this. They might even say that average total cost and marginal cost are the same in flat. The analysis will remain the same. You're going to find where MC equals MR, and that will be the key to finding your price and quantity. And you're going to still be able to find profit because you're going to find MC equals MR. You're going to find the Q. And then we're going to go up to the demand curve and see that vertical line, see where that vertical line hits ATC in demand. The difference is the profit. So just like before. Deadweight loss still exists. It's an arrow pointing from the quantity we are currently at to the perfectly competitive quantity, the allocative efficiency quantity, which is where MC and demand intersect. So we still have this triangular area. It's still deadweight loss, just like before. So don't let the way that the graph is drawn in special cases throw you off. Next time we meet, we're going to talk about some of the strategies that monopolists and other firms use outside of perfect competition to try and charge higher prices, and I will talk to you then.